Today, I'm taking a really deep dive into the video stabilization on the Sony A7S III. I'm going to be testing so many combinations, 4 different stabilization options including in-camera and software, different frame rates, a wide-angle lens as well as a tighter one, and all in several different environments testing various camera movements. Hello everyone and welcome to probably the most comprehensive A7S III stabilization guide, where I test and mix so many scenarios that probably hasn't all been covered in one video anywhere else. Okay, quick breakdown of the stabilization options. First one is Sony's in-body image stabilization. The sensor itself is on a 5-axis gyroscope that counteracts your movement, basically like a gimbal but with significantly less space to move. Second is active stabilization that couples digital stabilization with the in-body image stabilization to further smooth out movement. It's worth noting though that this comes at the cost of a 1.1 times crop. Because of that, 120 frames per second doesn't have active stabilization. Next is Sony's Catalyst Browse, a free media management program that lets you review your footage, check the metadata of your videos, and most importantly to me, offers what seems to be really high-end stabilization for compatible cameras. The A7S III and a few more recent Sony cameras are able to record the gyro information while the camera is recording and use that data for stabilization within the software. Last method will be the stabilization offered in Final Cut Pro. Scenario number 1 is a simple track of a subject walking away from me while I follow, trying my best to stay as steady as possible by doing the ninja walk. The first test is with my wide 24mm lens, which should have an easier time producing smoother footage over the 50mm lens that I will also test. The tighter the focal length, the more susceptible your footage is to camera shake. This is how 24 FPS looks and no stabilization. Of course, the footage is quite shaky. Putting on Final Cut stabilization definitely takes the shakes away, but then introduces some serious wobbling and distortion. I think overall it's an improvement, but I can't really say it looks good either. This is how it looks with IBIS turned on. Really only a slight improvement over the standard shot. Some of the micro shakes are gone, but overall still very shaky footage. This active stabilization is significantly smoother. It's free of the major camera shake as well as distortion, but it's still not perfect. Next is Catalyst Browse, and look how insanely smooth this footage looks. It honestly looks like the camera is on a gimbal with very little vertical movement from when I'm taking a step. Something difficult to achieve even on a gimbal with the most ninja-est of walks. The crop is quite minimal, with the processed and original clip looking completely different. I just want to mention that Catalyst Browse doesn't support 120 frames per second and requires several different camera settings to optimize performance, including requiring a higher shutter speed. I will go over all these settings as well as how Catalyst Browse and stabilization processing works in an upcoming video. Next, I wanted to see how well the footage would look if I doubled up with Final Cut Pro stabilization, which from now on I will refer to as FCPS. When I do stabilize the IBIS clip, the wobble seems to be less drastic. And putting it on active stabilization takes away the finer shakes but introduces slight distortion. In this case, you have to decide which one you think looks better, a slight wobble or shake. Shake is definitely more natural, but not everyone will notice a wobble. But keep in mind that you also introduce a crop when adding on the second layer of stabilization. Interestingly enough, when I put FCPS on the higher shutter speed clip that I use for Catalyst Browse, it actually performs quite similarly. There is still distortion, but it's so much less pronounced. Moving on to running all the same tests but at 60 frames per second. This lets us reduce playback to 40%, and slow motion tends to smooth out shake because now all the camera movement is spread over a clip that's 2.5 times longer. But of course this method won't help if you need regular speed playback or sound. This is how no stabilization looks when slowed down. Definitely a little smoother, but the shake is still obvious. However, now putting FCPS on this clip, it looks pretty good with minimal distortion. Very usable footage. Next is IBIS slowed down to 40%. I would say it's marginally better than no stabilization. FCPS also cleans it up really nicely. There's a similar wobble but with less of a crop. Active stabilization once again looks the best. Only a few slight shakes. Adding FCPS into this introduces minimal crop and no obvious distortion. If it isn't obvious already, it looks like adding FCPS to slow motion produces much more pleasing clips that are less distorted and cropped. Catalyst Browse produces such smooth footage. Looks great slowed down or at full speed. Last test for the 24mm is at 120 frames per second. This can be slowed down to 20%, creating a clip that's 5 times longer, further hiding the camera shake that we saw at 60 FPS. The shake is definitely less obvious, but like before, adding FCPS smooths it out very nicely with very little distortion. Something interesting occurs when you look at this IBIS clip. It's smoother than no stabilization, but now there's this unnatural mechanical-like movement. The clip will be clean, and then all of a sudden we'll have a very linear shift, followed by being clean, and then another linear shift. This is the IBIS trying to correct itself in camera and is actually occurring from the sensor being locked on a position and then physically shifting as it tries to counteract your movement. FCPS removes the sensor shift, but without the added stabilization, I would say the original is better than the IBIS. Moving on to a 50mm lens, a much tighter focal length that has no mercy for any camera shake. This is not good at all. Adding FCPS to this 24 frame per second regular shutter clip doesn't even wobble anymore, it just vibrates, which is equally as unusable. Unlike with the 24mm, the IBIS doesn't offer any obvious smoothing out. And with FCPS, we get the same vibrating effect. Using active stabilization with the 50mm is much less forgiving. For the most part, I'm not able to lock on besides for just a few seconds before getting the weird sensor shift effect, and back into plain camera shake chaos. I reshot this later in the evening by myself to try and be as smooth as possible without worrying about a subject, and I was able to get rid of the extreme shake, but we are left with the unnatural sensor shift. In addition, every so often I see what looks like an exposure flicker most obvious in the grass. Adding FCPS to this makes those sensor shifts a lot more natural, but the exposure flicker seems more pronounced when there isn't as much movement in the environment. Now for what seems to be the best stabilization for this kind of camera movement, Catalyst Browse with a higher shutter speed. I'm just so impressed with how much of an improvement it makes to the clip. There is basically no noticeable camera shake and completely free of wobble and distortion. FCPS also does a really good job with the higher frame rate, but there is noticeable distortion. Catalyst Browse wins again. Quickly touching on the other frame rates, I will say generally the results are similar to what we saw with the wider lens, but given how much more shake the 50mm lens has, the results are not quite as good. 60 frames per second with no stabilization has very limited improvement over the full speed video. And adding FCPS gets rid of it, but this time we get a massive crop and there is a noticeable vibration unlike with the 24mm. But it's still not as bad as regular shutter and 24 FPS. IBIS looks the same as no stabilization, and active is really not bad with the exception of sensor shift. But adding FCPS really cleans it up very nicely with minimal vibration and crop given how much less shaky the original footage is. Catalyst Browse takes the cake again, which at this point shouldn't be a surprise given how well it performed before. But the fact that it can cut through the added shake that a 50mm lens produces, it's really quite impressive. The crop isn't even that bad. 120 frames per second with no stabilization does little to control camera shake, but as everything is moving slower, FCPS works quite well. For 120 frames per second with IBIS, we see that similar sensor shift that we did before, but given that it's less erratic, FCPS works a little better here, I think. Okay, moving on to a different scene, vlogging. Given the weight of this camera, I don't think the A7S III is the first option for most people for vlogging, but we are here to test the limits of stabilization. And vlogging will generally be bumpier even at wider focal lengths because you're not going to be ninja walking around while talking to the camera. This is regular shutter, 24 frames per second, no stabilization. Really, this looks like a very standard vlog clip. I don't think it's the worst, but it's certainly not the best. Adding FCPS makes a mess of things, and I would personally pick no stabilization. Given how erratic the movement is, IBIS doesn't help, and active has periods of appearing to be better, but when the camera moves too much, it is unable to stay locked on. FCPS has a slightly lower crop here, but the footage vibrates. So can Catalyst Browse save this footage? Well, I would say overall yes, but given how much movement there is, I really had to crop in to remove all the major shake. I think it's still usable, but you are losing a lot of the background. I can also see a slight exposure flicker occurring again, which is a negative. And just for fun, I wanted to see how the 50mm would look. Unsurprisingly, with no stabilization, it's pretty extreme. FCPS processes the most unusable clip we'll see in this video, but Catalyst Browse comes in with some pretty smooth footage that is definitely usable and will probably not give your viewer a headache. However, the exposure flicker is quite pronounced here. These results in general are fine because no one would ever use this focal length for vlogging, but I just wanted to show how well Catalyst Browse works even at these extremes. Next up is a real estate scenario with a 24mm lens. I just wanted to know if the stabilization options could potentially remove the need for a gimbal. At 24 frames per second standard, IBIS and active look the same. Active looks better on the straightaway, but adding panning motion seems to mess everything up. Honestly, I'm trying to walk so smoothly, but it honestly looks like I'm walking around like this. Adding FCPS actually helps, but there is some distortion if you look closely, so I'm not sure how happy a client would be with this footage. Keep in mind that I'm shooting at 1.4 wide open to keep my ISO down, which creates a much thinner plane of focus than you'd want to be using for a real estate shoot. Now, as before, Catalyst Browse stabilizes really well, but there is another limitation I didn't think about until I started to do these tests. The higher shutter speeds required to have the software work properly causes banding from the overhead lights. It is as smooth as FCPS, but without the distortion. However, that banding is a problem. I've read that there is software that can remove this banding, but the examples I've seen online are for clips that look like this, and not for this one singular dark band that moves slowly throughout the frame. 60 frames per second let me walk a little faster in the hopes of my movement being smoother and more fluid. At a normal shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, the footage syncs up with the frequency of the overhead lights, so we don't have the banding anymore. Standard, IBIS, and active are similar with marginal improvements over 24 FPS, but adding FCPS looks much better here with noticeably less distortion than with 24 FPS. Catalyst Browse is the best as far as stabilization goes, but now the band is even darker because of the much higher frame rate, and the stabilization actually shifts the band up and down, which makes things even worse. Overall, it's not usable footage. After reviewing the footage of the 50mm vlog, and how well Catalyst Browse worked, I wanted to also try the tighter lens for a similar shot, but with the subject walking towards me as I walk backwards. No stabilization is bad, while IBIS and active look quite similar. FCPS just makes things vibrate like we've seen before, although it does smooth things out. Using the high shutter and Catalyst Browse does a really good job again. But so does FCPS with the higher shutter, which I guess is expected given the previous tests. Catalyst does get an edge though by not having any wobble distortion, and it also is free of the exposure flicker here. 60 FPS offers similar results to what we've seen throughout the other tests. Just slowing it down does offer a little bit of stabilization, and FCPS doesn't perform as well as it did on the previous high shutter FCPS clip with noticeable wobble. These same traits are also seen at 120 FPS. The last test of this video is a simple slide motion using the tighter 50mm lens without any walking. I used a moving chart to stay focused on to really see how much shake I would get throughout the entire frame. 24 frames per second looks as expected. Everything is clear, but there's movement around the frame for sure. Adding FCPS probably would work if you were shooting something else, but with all the bars and details in this chart, it creates flickering, so I won't be trying it on the other clips. This clip I was actually pleasantly surprised about. This is just IBIS with no other stabilization, and it does a fantastic job filtering out the micro shakes. When the camera movement isn't hugely exaggerated, IBIS seems to work really well. In fact, it looks just as good as active stabilization. This slide motion would probably give you similar results if you wanted to do a stationary pan, letting you get shots similar to how a fluid head would look on a tripod if you're steady enough. Given how good IBIS and active stabilization work in this scenario, Catalyst Browse has no problem delivering here as well. Because of this, I'm just going to shoot straight to how a standard shot without stabilization looks at 120 frames per second. This really shows how much less dramatic the micro shakes become when the footage is slowed down 5 times. Okay, spitfiring the pros and cons of all the stabilizations and what I learned today. The exposure flickering we saw when stabilizing using Catalyst browse was mostly only noticeable in lower light situations and at super wide apertures, which I was shooting at 1.4. FCPS produces less of a crop when you cut the clip to only show the scene that you want to show. Keeping the frames of the camera moving in and out of position seems to mess things up a little bit. FCPS also seems to not like motion blur like Catalyst browse and produces a much cleaner result when shutter speeds are bumped up. It also works better with slow motion when the movement is less extreme because it plays out over a longer duration. Catalyst browse requires you to crop in on your footage so it can use that extra space on the edges to stabilize the footage. For my tests, it was between 80 and 95% that I had to crop in on. This crop reduces your footage from 4K. At 50%, you are right back down to a 1080 clip. The 1.1 times crop from active stabilization in the A7S III still renders a 4K image. But as we've seen, the stabilization from Catalyst browse is so much better. Okay, this video took an insane amount of time to shoot, edit, and analyze. If you learned anything at all, tapping that like button would really mean a lot to me, and thank you so much if you do. Like I said earlier, there are several camera settings you need to consider if you want to get the best result with Catalyst browse. I'll be diving deeper into the software and making a video about it, which I will link here once it's up. I also have a ton of Sony A7S III tutorials and guides on my channel, so be sure to check one of those out, or this video that YouTube thinks you will enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.